Hi, this is Brian Daitzman, founder of The Intellectuals and host of History of the Present, a new series produced in conjunction with Lincoln Square. This is the sixth episode in the series. Here, we're bringing in authors and experts to help make sense of this current inflection point that we're experiencing in history, whether it's with democracy, inequality, authoritarianism, the current state of geopolitics, AI, robotics, the current space race. All of these different points are inflecting now. Part of this series is bringing on experts to help make sense of this moment. My guest today is Edward Wong, the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, where he covers global affairs, U.S. foreign policy, and the State Department. Edward is a former Beijing bureau chief, a former Iraq war correspondent, a Livingston Award winner, a Nyman Fellow, and part of a Times team that was a Pulitzer Prize winning finalist for international reporting. His book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, was published by Viking and is available wherever books are sold. It begins with Edward's father, a Chinese immigrant father in America who rarely spoke about his past, and opens into Mao's revolution, the People's Liberation Army, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and authoritarianism and empire. Edward, thank you for joining me today. I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks, Brian. I'm glad to be here.
As I was reviewing this book, I would just want to start sort of very sort of regarding you and your family. Let's sort of talk about this. What is this book really about? I found that with some authors, they do have some trouble writing about so personally about their parents, whether it's their father and their family. Did you have that challenge when writing this book?
Well, it's interesting. You're asking about the sort of personal take I had on history and on my family. I'll tell you how the idea for the book originated. I think that goes towards answering your question. So I originally, towards the end of my tour in China for the New York Times, I've been there for around eight to 9 years. I knew I wanted to write a book about China, and I wanted to capture some of the ideas that I have formed about China and about its history, its current state, and its direction. And I was wondering, how could I tell a story that encapsulates what I think about China and my assessment of where it's going based on the reporting I've done. And I thought, maybe the easiest way for me to do that, to keep a reader interested in this very complex subject and its very complicated history, is to tell it through the lens of my family, and specifically my father, because what I wanted to do was to tell a story of how current day China is still very much influenced by Maoist China. I think that theme has become much more overt and much more in the foreground in China in the last, say, 10 to 12 years. And so and my father had lived through Maoist China. In fact, he had dedicated himself for much of his time in China to serving Mao and the revolution, and he joined the People's Liberation Army as a result of that. And so I decided that I would interview my father, talk to him in great detail about what he had done when he was serving the army, and then use that narrative as the thread throughout the book that would draw the reader into both the history of Mao-era China and the history of contemporary China and what I saw there in China. And so it seemed very natural for me to integrate sort of that personal history into national history. And I had already spoken with my father somewhat in my 20s about what he had done in China. As you had mentioned, my father rarely spoke about his past when I was younger. When I was growing up in a suburb of DC in Alexandria, Virginia, I saw my father go off and work in a restaurant, work very long hours. Didn't see him much during the weekdays. I only saw him maybe once during the weekends, one day a week when he was off. And so we had time together. We watched, football games together, but we didn't talk a lot about his past. And it wasn't a thing he wanted to really dwell on. But then when I was in my 20s, I got very much interested in the history of China. I started taking courses at UC Berkeley, where I was attending grad school on Chinese history, Chinese politics. And then on my trips home back to the DC area, I would then sit down with my parents and talk to both my mom and my dad about their histories in China. And that's when I learned for the first time that my father had been a soldier in the Chinese army in the Mao era. I learned a little bit about what he had done and where he had been posted. But it was only after I lived in China myself for those 9 years, working for the New York Times and traveling around the country, that I really understood a lot about the context of the places he had been and the places where he had served. So then once I made the decision to write this book about China and I returned home to the US, I then sat down with my father for these much more detailed interviews. And that's when I got a lot more out of him, I think, about that personal history. And in some ways, it is a departure, I think, from my reporting. You know, as a reporter for a news organization like the Times, we rarely put ourselves in the story, and we rarely write about personal history. So that itself was a departure, and I had to learn a new style of writing to really capture that. But at the same time, I was very immersed in China for a big part of my adult life. The places where my father had served, I traveled out there. And so I really felt I knew something about the environment and something about the issues. So some parts of the writing came naturally because of the immersion that I had done in China itself.
Edward, I'm curious, as you grew older, more mature, and you're writing this book, did the understanding of who your father was, did it change? And if so, how did that affect your understanding of your father and your parents?
Yeah. I mean, when I first got interested in my father's story about his time in the army, I was in my 20s, as I said. And back then, the lens through which I was understanding that part of his life was like through the lens of a young man who was more idealistic. I think I myself was probably more idealistic back in my 20s. And so like what I really gravitated towards was my father's sense of idealism, I think, when he signed up for the army, and why he believed he was working for the good of the country. And sort of the sense of mission that he had. And I think that I felt that there was a universality to his story, because I think a lot of people, when they're younger, from their teens through their 20s, through their 30s, have a lot of idealism. They want to change the world. And then, as I explored China more, and as my own view on that country and on the world changed because of my own personal experiences and my career, then I felt that my interest in my father's story was not only about the sense of idealism that he had in his 20s, but it was also about him coming to terms with the reality of the revolution that he was serving, the darker aspects of Mao era China, and essentially how his service in the army was essentially laying the groundwork for the type of military occupation that would take place in parts of Northwest China, the Xinjiang region, as you mentioned, and that influence what's happening out there today. As we know, and as your audience might know from some of the headlines and stories that have been reported of the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of repression out in that region. The government, of course, will say that what they're trying to do is to bring stability to the region, because there have been waves of violence out there. And when you speak with non-ethnic Han people out in the region, people who are from the ethnic Uyghur group or the ethnic Kazakhs, they'll say that they felt forms of state repression out there that probably people in other parts of China do not experience, except for arguably in Tibet. So then the lens then that I saw some of my father's experiences through was laying the groundwork for the system of security and military presence out there in that region that carry on through today. And I think I came to that understanding because of my later life experiences where I did travel extensively to that region, did reporting in the region, and also came to understand the forms of power exercised by the Communist Party better as I spent more time in China.
Edward, a lot of what you're discussing talks about how present history is in this discussion. And I feel like it would be hard for the audience to understand maybe where China is right now without fully appreciating the 19th century and the 20th centuries. And according to my very limited studies, the 19th century for China was an era of humiliation. The 20th century, the early 20th century, there were imperial powers carving up China. There was Japan. Can you just explain how this history, which is very present, probably moved your father and had an influence on your father in helping with the, he was an idealistic young man. He saw what had happened to his country.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think many Chinese feel that that's a powerful narrative through modern China. So my father was born in Hong Kong. He was born in a British colony in part of China that had been colonized during the Opium Wars. And he was born into a middle-class Cantonese family that was living in Hong Kong. His father sold herbal medicine, was an herbal medicine exporter who would bring in herbal medicine from China and then export it and sell it in Hong Kong, export it to Chinese businesses in Southeast Asia. So my father's very much came from this sort of middle-class capitalist background in Hong Kong. And because of the Japanese War, when the Japanese tried to take over much of Asia, they invaded Hong Kong, they seized Hong Kong from the British. My father then had to leave Hong Kong and go to southern China, where his ancestral village was back after 1941 when the Japanese occupied Hong Kong. And so he and his older brother, Sam, went and lived in their ancestral village in southern China in Guangdong province. And they then felt and saw the Japanese occupation in southern China and heard about the war that the Chinese government and the Communist Army in the North were waging against the Japanese. And they heard obviously about the Japanese atrocities that were taking place throughout China. And then my father ended up going to high school in Guangzhou, the capital of Guangdong province. So they were in China the entire time during this war, with during the latter years of the war with the Japanese. And so that really left an imprint on him, and it left an imprint on his family. Even today, for example, his older brother, Sam, who lives near him in Virginia, has refused to buy Japanese cars, for instance. So the history that you're talking about, Brian, is very much present in people. They felt the national humiliation, the grievances that arose during wartime. And partly my father was drawn to the communist cause because he felt that the nationalist government that was ruling China at the time during the Japanese War had failed to repel the Japanese invaders. They had failed to defend the country. And not only that, they were also a corrupt government. When he was going to high school in Guangzhou, he saw the corruption around him. He saw gambling dens. He saw brothels. He understood that police were paid off, that senior government officials took bribes. And so he felt that the communists could bring about a change that would strengthen China, that would essentially bring China on par with the great industrial nations of the world, which back then were essentially the United States and to a lesser degree Britain. And when the Japanese War ended in 1945 and he was in high school in Guangzhou, he heard about he heard details of the Chinese Civil War that was reigniting because the communists and the nationalists were then the truce that they had formed to fight the Japanese broke apart after the Japanese defeat, and they started fighting each other again. And a lot of the fighting took place in northern China. My father didn't see much of the fighting down there in the far south, but he did hear about the triumphs of the Communist Army led by Mao as they won battle after battle in the North, and he sort of supported them implicitly because he felt that if they did beat the nationalists, then they would bring about that class revolution and that modernization that Mao had been talking about. And so my father graduated from high school in 1950 in Guangzhou. And this is, I lay all this out in my book. Then he decided he would go north to Beijing to enter university. But on the very first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, the first anniversary of Mao standing up the People's Republic of China, my father marched in Tiananmen Square in front of Mao. He was one of many thousands of people who marched in the square. He was in a group of students. There were also factory workers that marched there. There were soldiers. It was essentially a military parade with some civilian elements. And they were cheering on Mao and Mao's compatriots. And Mao was up there in the stands waving to them. And my father was really galvanized by that. He remembers that day very vividly. And at the same time, Mao was calling on young people to join the army because China had then entered another war. It had decided to support North Korea in its fight against the American army and against the South Korean army on the Korean Peninsula. And so Mao and the communists felt very much threatened by the presence of the American army on the Korean Peninsula. He exhorted young people to come out, especially young men, to come out and join the army and go fight on the peninsula. And so my father signed up for that only a few months into his university education in Beijing. And he went to the far northeast of China to start training to join the Chinese Air Force. So that's like the backdrop of his devotion and loyalty to the communist cause and why he decided to join the military.
So the Civil War, for people who may not know, this was an awful civil war. Many people died. Atrocities were horrific. What was your father's understanding of Mao?
So my father, the Civil War was horrific, and there were massacres that the Communist Army carried out against the nationalists, especially in the northeast of China. My father at the time had a very idealistic vision of Mao. I mean, so did many other young Chinese. He was not the exception in this regard. And also, of course, Mao galvanized a revolution in the rural base of China. So not only did Mao get factory workers and people living in the cities, laborers living in the cities on his side, but the sort of innovation that he carried out in terms of warfare and the Communist Revolution was to get farmers and peasants on his side in the rural areas. And I think all of them had the same idea that there was corruption in China, that the nationalists were corrupt, that there was a class system that was entrenched in China and that needed to be overthrown. My father, I mean, part of the irony is that my father did come from this capitalist family in Hong Kong, which is very different than rural China. But at the same time, because of what he experienced during those years, he was growing up in China under the Japanese occupation during the Civil War. He really came to believe in the cause. And also, I think that Mao was a charismatic leader. I mean, Mao knew how to speak the language of the oppressed masses. He knew what buttons to push. He knew how to rally people around him. And my father was one of those people who really saw him as a true leader.
So I just want to make clear for people watching this that this Civil War, even though I believe it ended, what was it, 49, I believe.
Exactly.
The consequences of that war are still with us today. And they still have a very big effect on U.S. policy towards the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that we could maybe bring this to the present. How did that war end? How is there, like Taiwan, explain how we're in this current situation where we have the People's Republic of China, we have Taiwan. Taiwan once represented China at this at the UN Security Council.
Right.
It's very confusing. How can you explain maybe how this, and I know this is history of the present, right? So Nixon goes to China. If we could maybe do a very condensed version of how we get to here.
We'll try and crunch down decades of history into a couple
as much as possible.
Right. So as I said, that there are two sides in the Chinese Civil War. The nationalists are led by Chiang Kai-shek, who was supported by the Americans. But, this isn't one of those things where it's like a thing about democracy and Western liberal values versus communism and leftist authoritarianism. What we have during the Civil War are two authoritarian leaders. One is Chiang Kai-shek, who is essentially what many people would call nowadays a fascist. And he led the nationalist government and the nationalist army, and they were fighting the communists and Mao. And so the communists are winning battle after battle in the north. And then in 1949, they sweep down further into the south. And in October of 1949, Mao proclaims victory in Beijing and proclaims the founding of the People's Republic. During that time, Chiang Kai-shek's army is in retreat, and what they do is they retreat to this island, Taiwan, that's off the southeast coast of China. Now, Taiwan has a very complicated history. Taiwan was at one point partly ruled by the Manchus of the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty in China. A part of Taiwan was ruled by the Manchus as an outpost. But under post-Qing, Taiwan was never firmly under the control of any sort of modern republic of China, and not really firmly under the control of the nationalists. But once Chiang Kai-shek went to the island, then they established control, and they basically ruled the island in an autocratic and authoritarian manner for decades. In fact, they carried out atrocities and martial law in Taiwan, essentially sort of colonial oppression in the eyes of some of Taiwan and the people who had lived there. And so right now, during that time, the United States supported Taiwan. Taiwan claimed that it was the legitimate government of China, the Republic of China. And for years, it represented China at the United Nations with the support of the United States, even though an increasing number of countries, including some of America's closest allies, were starting to recognize the People's Republic of China, established by Mao, as the legitimate government of China. So then what happens is in 1971 and 72, for a series of reasons, including ones related to the Vietnam War and the Cold War and the U.S. rivalry with the USSR, Nixon and his closest foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, decide to do outreach to Maoist China. They have secret talks at first with Mao and Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, and then they have a diplomatic trip to China for the first time in decades. Nixon goes to China in 1972, a seminal event, I think, in post-World War II history. And from then on, the U.S. and the People's Republic grow closer. And in 1979, in the Carter era, the U.S. officially recognizes the People's Republic of China as a government. The UN seat that once went to Taiwan has gone to the PRC, and the U.S. decides that it will continue giving certain aid to Taiwan, such as arms aid, but it doesn't have a policy on whether Taiwan is a legitimate nation or not, like is an official nation. Like it's basically exists in this limbo state for the U.S. where it doesn't take a position on the sovereignty of Taiwan, even though it no longer has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. It now has sort of this informal diplomatic relation of Taiwan, but it has formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And over the decades since then, more and more countries around the world have abandoned Taiwan as a diplomatic partner and instead formed diplomatic ties with China. There's no national government that has formal diplomatic ties with both. You have to choose one or the other.
Right.
And so right now, Taiwan is only recognized formally by around a dozen national governments, as well as the Vatican. And these are all fairly small governments in Latin America, in Africa, in the South Pacific. And the U.S. is not one of them. The U.S. has, since 1979, the U.S. has recognized the People's Republic. But at the same time, the U.S. Says it supports Taiwan. It gives weapons to Taiwan. In the Biden administration, President Biden said 4 times that if China were to try and invade Taiwan, the U.S. military would get involved. Trump has not taken that position. Trump has not stated whether the U.S. would get involved if China were to try and invade Taiwan. And so that's the very complicated situation that we're talking about today.
And Edward, thank you so much for kind of getting us to this moment. So we could clearly see there's a line from your father's time in the PLA to today, and my question is, the current president of China, Xi Jinping, he has said that he would like the PLA to be ready to be prepared to invade Taiwan. Not saying he's going to, or that China's going to, but he would like them to be prepared. What is your understanding of President Xi Jinping? What kind of man is he?
Right. Well, Xi Jinping is a very singular figure in contemporary China, in the top ranks of the party. He comes from what we call the princeling class, or the group of people known as princelings, because they're the descendants of the original communist revolutionaries who fought with Mao and helped establish the People's Republic with Mao. So
it's a new class system,
father,
essentially.
Right. It's kind of a new class system in this sort of so-called classless era of communist government and society. But essentially, this this what we call the second generation red class, or the princelings, they're considered communist royalty. And so his father, Xi Jinping, was one of these original revolutionaries who was a very close compatriot of Mao's, served in very high positions in the Chinese government. In fact, when my father was posted out to northwest China, the region of Xinjiang, in the 1950s, the person who was running policy in that far northwest area was Xi Jinping's father. So I think that there's many, when I was writing my book, there were so many different resonances of history between the 1950s era and now. And one of them is sort of the continuity of the Xi family in the top echelons of the party. And then during Mao's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, Xi Jinping's father was purged from the party by Mao, and then regains his status in the party elite after Mao dies, and there's a reform period in China. So Xi Jinping comes from that background, and he lived through the chaos of that Cultural Revolution decade, when his father was purged, put in prison, and when he was sent to a village, to work in the farms. And the ideas that he brought with him from that period, from this very traumatic period, were that the China needs stability, and the party needs to maintain control of China. That is paramount for China. That if control ever slips away from the party, then China could descend into chaos. And so he has gone about consolidating his own power at the top ranks of China, and he has also consolidated the power of the party in Chinese society. And so what we've seen under Xi is that China has taken a much more authoritarian direction and that the period when I lived in China was probably a final period for now of there being more possibilities, I think, in China for a lot of people. And now there's been a closing off of some of those avenues within society in China, and in things like discourse in media, for instance, and about policies, and in a flourishing of civil society. A lot of that has become much more constricted. And she has taken China in that direction. And at the same time, in foreign policy, she has taken China in a much more muscular direction. And I think the reason for that is, one, she feels that he is fulfilling some of the aspects of, the original revolution, which is to stand up China and bring it back into the premier ranks of the world stage and have it be a challenger to the United States. The same mission that my father believed Mao would accomplish, but instead Mao's policies led China to ruin. She thinks he's bringing China up to that status. And also, there are structural reasons. China, because of the way its economy has boomed since the death of Mao, and its ability to grow its military, then it also feels it has a lot more influence in the world. It has a much greater economic influence than it ever has, challenging the U.S. in many parts of the world. It's the greatest trade partner for many countries, displacing, for example, the United States in huge swaths of the world. Its military is the fastest growing military in the world, and is becoming bolder in its operations in the Asia Pacific region, especially in the seas and the oceans around China. And it also has enormous diplomatic influence now around the world. So it's just in this structurally, it's in this place where it is now a superpower that has not existed in its modern history since, the early days of Mao, when there was this Cold War going on. But I think now there really are only two superpowers in the world, and those are the United States and China. And she knows that.
I just want to bring this back to the United States. President Donald Trump has praised President Xi Jinping. He has thought he has praised his ability to run. I'm quoting him. I think he used the term, he praised his iron fist when talking about China. The president also historically has praised the Tiananmen Square massacre. What do you think the Communist Party, particularly President Xi Jinping, how do you think he sees the United States under President Donald Trump?
Well, I think that, what we glean of what senior party officials are thinking comes from our discussions with some sources who have some insight into the party, but there's a certain level of opacity there. So there's a certain level of analysis and guesswork when we're trying to think about what she is thinking. But I think that what they essentially feel is that there's an opportunity right now globally for China to step into this power vacuum that exists in certain parts of the world because of the U.S. Both pulling back on some of its resources that it deploys in the world, whether it's diplomatic, military, economic resources, and also because of the increasing view by other countries of the U.S. as an unstable ally or partner. And so China is trying to make the case in many parts of the world that it's the stable superpower in the world, that it's not going to start wars, it's not going to create conflicts that cause surges in oil prices as the Iran war has done, and that it will not impose tariffs, extreme tariffs on other countries, and then try and change that tariff policy on a whim week by week. So it's trying to make that case to other countries of the world. China does have coercive economic policies that it will deploy against other countries. But I think it's trying to say that in the era of Donald Trump, then at least if you look at China, its policies are more predictable than those of the United States. And it's not for me to judge whether that's the case, but I think a lot of countries are starting to see China as the more predictable superpower in the world today.
And I mean, how if we were to look at it overall, I mean, given all of your reporting, how do you see that what is China is basically saying is, listen, we're a superpower too. We can help you with things. We're more stable. We're not going to cause a decrease in living standards, whether it's to, let's say, cause a war with Iran, which will lead to very high inflation, energy prices, and famines. Do you think that there are or could be close to a turning point in how, given I think some of the bellicosity from this administration, of how the United States will be looked at in the future? Because I've heard some say, well, the first Trump administration was an anomaly. The second, then President Biden, and we had more of a return to sort of classic Democratic Republican foreign policy. But then the Americans, despite what happened, the fact that there was a pandemic, despite the fact that the president was impeached twice, chose to elect him again. How do you think people are looking at the United States as a guarantor of stability, which you sort of touched upon, but I think more broadly beyond China, given your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to officials from around the world, whether they're diplomats, military officials, or others, the sense you get is that there's a much greater need now among countries, including among, for example, European allies of the U.S., NATO allies, to hedge somehow. And we've seen people like, Macron, President Macron of France, coming out and saying that Europe has to be established an independent foreign policy. It can no longer be this partner of the U.S. that relies on the U.S. for military guarantees, and that Europe has to both build up its militaries, establish an independent economic policy, and not be so dependent on the United States for various aspects of its economic and military well-being. And I think that you would hear that sometimes publicly from other leaders, but sometimes privately because they don't want to get on the bad side of President Trump. But if they're being truthful and talking to you in private, they will say that. They would say that we essentially need to hedge against the U.S. And as I said, this presents a certain level of opportunity for China, because while many of these countries don't necessarily trust China either, I don't think countries in Europe see China as for example, necessarily a like-minded partner. It's countries in Europe value democratic principles, for instance, and China obviously does not do that. But at the same time, they understand that China is a powerful economic engine, and that on certain issues, for instance, on issues related to environmental crises, climate change, renewable energy, China is well ahead of the United States on policies like this, policies that are considered of value by the European allies of the United States. So I think that what we'll see countries in many parts of the world, whether it's Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, looking to balance between different powers, and also trying to create greater independent space for themselves in this multipolar world as well.
Well, you hit on a bunch of points. I mean, I think you really spelled out that we really are in a world of balance of powers, I think, because our allies are going to other nations for stability. I'm curious to understand this because the war in Ukraine obviously gets a lot of attention, and a lot of Americans have an attachment to the people of Ukraine. I would be curious in understanding, what does China view the Russian Federation? Because I recall seeing, I believe it was President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin, there was this talk of a no limits partnership, right?
Mhm.
But I've read experts in China say that's maybe an inaccurate understanding, that it's really more of an extractive relationship where China is essentially, they know Russia needs help. And this is an opportunity possibly to get back some historic lands. And they're looking at the long, big picture, not necessarily will they or will they not win in Ukraine per se, but they're looking at this in terms of purely their national interest. Is that possible for you to talk about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that many countries look at things in terms of national interest. And I think in both Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States that's true. In some ways, some people will say Trump just expresses that openly, whereas like other administrations might mask it with talk of ideas and values and things like that. But national interest is usually the driving force in foreign policy for most countries. Now, China has several national interests when it comes to the Russia relationship. And one of them is, economic interest, and there's certain commercial interests related to them, including energy exchange and purchases and military cooperation and commercial transactions related to weapons, for instance. But I think that when you're looking at the big geopolitical picture, China does see Russia as a partner that it wants on side to balance against the United States, and I think there is some level of personal bond between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. It's not just a purely transactional thing, even though when we look at these leaders, we might see them through a transactional lens. But both leaders have certain ideas about their countries, about their grievances, their national grievances, and about America that are very consistent with each other. And so both leaders, I think, see part of their mission as to reinvigorate the fallen imperial nature of their countries. So like you mentioned Ukraine, and one of Putin's ideas about Ukraine, as we know, is that it shouldn't exist as a modern nation state. It should be absorbed into Russia, and that he wants to restore to a certain degree the Russian imperium that existed, not even during the Soviet Union, but even before the Soviet Union in Imperial Russia. He actually thinks that there were mistakes that the Bolsheviks up to Gorbachev made, and that the end goal, the end state of what Russia should be, is the imperium before the 20th century. And in many ways, he also feels the same way. Like he thinks that there is this empire that China once was, and the Qing dynasty, the last empire, was one of the great land empires of the world. And of course, it became subjugated to a certain degree by the seafaring imperial powers of Europe, and you pointed out Japan as well, and the United States to a degree. And so Xi thinks like part of his mission is to reinvigorate or resurrect the Chinese empire. And that's a big theme of my book, which is why I call it partly at the edge of the meaning of at the edge of empires, in part that mission to resurrect the empire, and how it started from the Mao era and carries on up to Xi Jinping, and that my father was part of that mission. And so both Xi and Putin have that in mind as one of their driving principles. And at the same time, they see the United States as the power that wants to keep both countries from accomplishing that. So I think they really have that in common, and it's not a superficial thing. It is a kind of deeper current that runs through both of them and runs through their backgrounds. As we know, Putin was part of the KGB, and he saw in the fall of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and the sphere of influence of Russia was a big thing for him. Xi Jinping, as I said, came from that original red revolutionary background. And so like their backgrounds as part of these communist powers is important to them. And I think they both see the United States as trying to turn their countries into victims, and trying to dismantle the spheres of influence of both countries.
if we can return, Edward, if we can return back to your book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, I really sort of, what did you learn about your father that you didn't know before? Like, how did your view of him change? Right. I mean, what were some lessons or some things you learned that really maybe change your view on him, your family, China, maybe the United States? Because you talk a lot about identity. You talk a lot about, right, your father is this idealistic young man. Obviously, we talk about communism and President Xi Jinping. There's this new sort of class structure, right? And sort of a lot of your book sort of discusses sort of this imperium, right? But this idealism too, and this sort of there's obvious tension between those. Can you maybe talk about that a little?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of things I learned, and one is that sense of strong nationalism about China and what it was before in the imperial past and what it could be in the future runs strongly through many Chinese. So I learned that both from talking to my father and learning about his views and why he joined the army. And also in my time in China, as I talked to many Chinese, like one thing, even Chinese who were critical of the party and of, for example, officials who were running the government in the areas in which they lived, like even those people hoped that China would become this great power again, and that it would be able to challenge the other great powers of the world, including the United States, that it would at least be on par with them, even if it doesn't need to be an adversary to the United States, but it should be at least a balancing point to the United States. And I think that sense of nationalism runs throughout modern Chinese history, and it's strong whether you're talking about a farmer out in a rural area in the provinces, or like a wealthy business person in Shanghai, or a party official in Beijing. It's something that exists for them. And it's also something that I think many overseas Chinese feel strongly, even though their first loyalty will be to whatever homeland they've adopted. But at the same time, they would like to see China become a great power. I mean, I think that many of them feel pride in the sense that China has come a long ways now since the depredations of the Mao era. And I think that was something that came through to me as I interviewed my father, both about his background and about his current views on China. I think the other thing that that became very apparent to me, and I think that I was trying to convey to readers of the book, is that, as we go through our lives here in America or in other cities in the West, we often come across these people who are working in restaurants, who might have menial jobs. Many of them have immigrated here from other countries. Maybe they don't speak great English, but they all have these very complex backgrounds in their home countries. And they've all experienced these very complicated changes in their societies and in the politics of those countries. And sometimes they're, fleeing persecution from those countries. Sometimes they came to the United States or other nations for economic reasons, or because they have family members living here. But they all have these like very rich histories, personal histories that unfolded in their home countries and that we're completely unaware of. Like they're the Uber driver from Afghanistan who's taking us around Washington, but behind our very superficial interactions with them, there's a very rich history, and oftentimes that history could also have very traumatic moments as well. And so I think that part of what I wanted to do, I learned that about my parents. I learned much more about my parents' histories as I was researching my book, and I think that partly what I want to convey to the reader was that there are these many of these immigrants have these very complex histories that if we took time to learn about that, they would be probably fairly stunning to many of us.
So, Edward, I've got really two questions left, and really the penultimate question. When I was a young man, I remember reading about an admiral Imperial China named, and forgive me if I'm misstate his name. It was Zhang He,
Right.
and
Jumbo,
under
yeah.
and my understanding was that he was this admiral who basically led a fleet of
Hmm.
Chinese ships. He pushed power, he projected power for China. And then I believe it was the Ming Dynasty. They said, no more of this, right? And they turned against and became more insular. Right now, and this is a rough analogy, it's not the same. Right now, the United States is firing scientists. The United States is going out of its way to frustrate friends and allies, and also pursuing public policies, whether it's anti-vaccine, um, pro pro global warming, and when all your policies are going towards a certain point, I think it's okay to just state it openly. Do you believe, Edward, in your studies and your reporting, that when great powers turn against knowledge, decline is basically inevitable at some point?
I think it can definitely set a country back by years or decades, and I think that there's an interesting parallel with Mao era China, because essentially we saw in Mao era China ideology overtook expertise.
Yeah.
And there was a purging of people throughout society, whether it's from the government or from academic institutions or from sort of upper ranks of workplaces, based on the notion of whether they were ideologically consistent with communist principles and the communist revolution and this new vision of society, or whether they somehow were entrenched in the old ways or had these older ways of thinking or had ties to sort of capitalists or whatever. And so I think that when ideology, this like strict vision of ideology overtakes expertise, then a society can definitely find itself in trouble. And I think that that's a question that has arisen now in the U.S., as you point out, and that people are grappling with right now, is whether we're in a moment now where a certain level of ideology is overtaking institutions, and that the government is trying to impose its ideology on, for instance, universities around the country and on scientific institutions, and in pulling back funding from science. Now, of course, Trump supporters and the MAGA movement will say, well, liberals have brought in their own ideology into these institutions. And so what we're trying to do is to counteract what had been a liberal ideological movement. And they themselves will actually compare sort of Western liberal ideology to, in some ways, to communist ideology, saying, oh, it's just like overbearing leftist ideology that has been placed in institutions and we're just trying to uproot them. So that's their argument. But of course, I think that one thing that has been alarming to many people is, as you point out, the sort of turn against science, turn against technical expertise. And I think part of the irony is that we're in this era when it seems technology is really the frontier by which superpowers are sort of like vying for superiority in the world, both in terms of economic dominance as well as military dominance, and issues like AI, how we address the climate crisis, how we go forward in quantum computing.
Yeah.
All of these things are things that rely on technology. And when we see a rollback of that in the United States, then I think that does cause alarm among many educated people.
Edward, what are you working on now? What can people look for you? Are you working on any new books, any new projects? I'm very curious to understand what you're working on. Also, we talked about a lot of very heavy subjects. What would you tell people watching this, whether in the United States, the People's Republic of China, anywhere watching this, who are genuinely concerned about the future, and how they should really be taking in this moment?
Right. So what I'm working right now, I'm covering the second Trump administration, as you know, and that's pretty much more than a full-time job. It's almost all my waking hours are spent thinking about foreign policy, and so I've devoted all my energies to that. I think it's an important moment, historical moment, and so I'm glad that I'm at the New York Times able to document it. I'm not working on a current book project because I'm just focusing right now on that news coverage, but maybe a book project will arise out of that topic or some other topic in the coming years. I do think that in terms of the precarious position we find ourselves in, I think that like people constantly ask the question, will superpowers go to war? Will the US and China go to war? And I think that question maybe becomes more accentuated because there have been so many wars in recent years that have captured global attention, and that includes Russia invading Ukraine, includes things like the Sudanese civil war, includes the U.S. military operations in Venezuela and the Pacific and the Caribbean, it includes the U.S. attacks on Iran starting last year, and then now this full-fledged war that we're in, and of course Israel and the October 7th attacks by Hamas and Israel's war in Gaza. So I think that there's a sense of instability right now in the world. But I would say that in terms of the two preeminent superpowers, the US and China, that there is a level of practicality still among officials, that they're seeking some form of stability in that relationship, and that there are structural tensions in the relationship. Both are military power, and I think the main conflict point is the fact that both are military powers in the Asia Pacific region. The US is the dominant power, but China would like to be the dominant power in the Asia Pacific. So that's a point that is very difficult to reconcile. But at the same time, I think both are nuclear powers, and both know that there would be severe consequences to a war that involved the two of them, whether it's over Taiwan or over anything else. Both are deeply embedded in the world, in the global economy, even though we have this sort of populist idea right now in the US of needing to unwind some of those global connections. But I think that the US still remains a huge economic driver in the global economy, and so does China. And in fact, we have not seen a huge drop in trade between those two countries, even though Trump has tried to impose these tariffs. And so I think that economic entwinement of the two countries with each other and of the two countries throughout the global economy means that the chance of outright war between the two countries is not as high, I think, as some people think. That, along with the fact that we're talking about two nuclear powers here, and there has not been a time in contemporary history when two nuclear armed powers have gone into a full-fledged conventional war against each other. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Edward, it was a real honor to have you here today with History of the Present. We'd love to have you back to discuss these issues, discuss international events. We'd also love to discuss some domestic issues that have international have relation to international let me say policy. Anything else you'd like to say before we go and exit? I think
no. I mean, I think you asked great questions about my book, Brian, and I think that for people who are interested in it, I think it'll give you a great sense of the arc of Chinese history from Mao all the way up until now, and really frame like what's going on right now between U.S.-China relations, but also give you a very personal take on understanding Chinese history through the lens of my family. I think that your questions, Brian, really hit on that. And I think that that's important for us. I mean, your podcast is about history. And I think that sort of looking for those personal avenues into history really is the way for us to better understand the world, where it was and where it's going.
Well, Edward, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'd love to have you on again soon.
Thanks a lot, Brian.